Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Steve Rayner. I am with my colleague, Professor Michael Keith over here, co-director of the Oxford Programme for the Future of Cities. This is an interdisciplinary programme that seeks to provide a means by which a wide range of activity that goes on around the university, around issues to do with the city, can be coordinated and learn from each other. And we are delighted to be able to put on each term a distinguished lecture, and this is the distinguished lecture for this term. And we are equally delighted that Professor Simon Marvin from Durham University has kindly consented to join us to lead the presentation of the lecture tonight, which he will be doing in collaboration with his colleague Mike Hodson. I've had the pleasure of first meeting Simon actually when I first returned here to the UK 10 years ago to take on the directorship of the Economic and Social Research Council's Science and Society programme. And Simon was the successful proposer of one of the very first projects that we funded under that programme. And so I soon got to know the organisation that he headed at that time, which was the Centre for Sustainable Urban and Regional Futures, or CERF, at Salford University. And Simon headed that up for a dozen years or so. And subsequently he's also held appointments at Newcastle as well as at Durham. His current title is Carillion Chair of Low Carbon Cities in the Department of Geography, and he's Deputy Director of the Durham Energy Institute. And those of you who know Simon's work will know that he's published widely on issues to do with world cities and climate change, technological mobilities, telecommunications, and urban infrastructure, which is in fact, I think, the subject of the last book you co-edited with Simon Guy, if I remember rightly, came out a couple of years ago, which I hardly recommend. As I say, he's going to be co-presenting tonight with Mike Hodson, and Mike is Associate Director of CERF, the organisation from which Simon proceeded on to Durham, having joined CERF in 2003 as a research fellow, and we indeed had the pleasure of meeting in Manchester back in the time when I was heading up the Science and Society Research Programme. So the topic of the lecture tonight is Low Carbon Nation, and with no further ado, I'm going to turn over to Simon, ask you all to welcome Simon Marvin and Mike Hodson.
Thank you, Steve and Mike and your colleagues for inviting us along today. We've sort of slightly used the opportunity of talking to you today as a way of myself and Mike doing some more development work on a new book project that we've started about a year and a half ago. So we are going to do a double act in terms of a presentation, and I now realise I haven't turned on my. Do I need to turn on a button? There we go. I'm now live. Can you hear me? This is. I should give you a few words of context for this project. It's a project that we've been doing alongside other work. So it's something that we've been squeezing in between other commitments, and we've talked about aspects of this work, and we hadn't had an opportunity to bring this work together into a single argument and presentation. So what we've tried to do in this talk is to weave together a set of work that's been funded in lots of different ways, and through a process of improvisation, try to construct a sort of bigger argument about the notion of low carbon nation. And we're going to do the talk in two halves. Mike's going to do the first part of the talk, and I'll do the second. Then hopefully we'll have some time for some questions, and we can see, we can sort of lay out to you the sort of argument that we're trying to make about the notion of low carbon transition and low carbon Britain. Mike.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Steve. And good evening, everybody. Simon said we're going to make an argument this evening, and it's an argument about the sort of low carbon Britain, the sort of low carbon nation that we think is developing. And as Simon also said, this is something of a new argument, trying to stitch together some ideas that we've been working on for some time. But there is a longer standing context to what we're about to say. Both Simon and I have a long standing intellectual interest in the relationship between cities, regions and their infrastructure systems, and trying to understand something about the interrelationship between cities and regions and their infrastructure systems, how those interrelationships are organised, how they're governed, and how they might be organised differently and governed differently. So in that sense, we're interested in the politics, the reproduction, and the transformation of those sets of interrelationships. And as Simon also briefly mentioned, we've developed this agenda around not just one project, but a number of different projects for UK research councils, both EPSRC and ESRC, through European framework projects, through work with national government, and also through a variety of subnational agencies. And we've produced books through this agenda, both Simon and myself together as co-authors, but also edited along with other colleagues such as Harriet Bulkley up at Durham and Simon Guy at Manchester. Okay, so the argument we want to make is to take some of those long-standing ideas and to think about them in the context of an emerging set of debates and ideas that are unfolding internationally, but particularly to look at them in the way they're unfolding in the UK at the moment. And we start from the point that a low-carbon future has, in many senses, become pervasive. It's been picked up across the formal party political divide and has been prioritised by all stripes of major political parties in the UK. You can see that through headline figures such as 80% targets for reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And what those very radical aspirations imply are visions that imply a radically different way of organising relationships, primarily between the way energy is produced, the way it's consumed, and its relationships to the city. We also need to recognise that alongside those aspirations, carbon-based activity is deeply historically embedded. It's embedded in the practices within the city, mobilities across the city, local economies, and the practices of everyday life in households across cities. And so in that sense, when we start to talk about a transition, we need to think about the notion of transition in a much more than a technical sort of way. We need to see transition as being multifaceted in that yes, it's technological, but it also involves behavioural change. And it involves activity at a multiplicity of scales, from the supranational down through the national, the urban, the regional, and so on. And so what you start to see here is that as a necessity for an effective low carbon transition, this requires a wide range of social and institutional interests and forms of technologies, potentially. You know, this can include utilities, policymakers, householders, regulators, and so on and so forth. And so you see there's a wide variety of expectations potentially about what low carbon futures could look like. So what we think is an emerging issue is the relationship between the what of low carbon transition, the aspirations in terms of decarbonisation, and how that's to be achieved. And in playing with this gap, what we're trying to do is try to understand something about the different social and political contexts within which low carbon futures are being made. In doing that, we're particularly interested in three sets of issues and questions. First of all, as an overarching question, we're interested in trying to understand something qualitatively about the type of low carbon future, the type of low carbon Britain that's being made. Secondly, to understand what it looks like in all its variations. And thirdly, to try and understand something about the motivations for low carbon transition, whether this is about, in some senses, trying to reinforce the status quo, to maintain the status quo, or whether it challenges it and it's about, low carbon futures are about something that are fundamentally transformational. Okay, so those questions about what and how also lead to issues to do with why, and to try and understand something about different motivations for low carbon futures. It seems fairly obvious from the characterisation of low carbon that one motivation is around levels of decarbonisation. But there are also issues with the way in which low carbon futures are often framed as being about green growth, they're about economic development. There are also geopolitical aspects to this, in that low carbon futures are often framed as being around energy security and enhancing energy security, and are often mobilised in terms of supporting claims around fuel poverty and social justice issues. Yet when we start to think about different forms of low carbon space that need to be constructed around this agenda at an urban and regional scale, it's important to think not just about the construction of low carbon spaces and low carbon futures, but to recognise that in some senses a carbon past has to be constructed as well. I guess there weren't too many voices in the middle of the 19th century saying that their aspirations were to create a carbon-based economy. There are a number of processes running in parallel around processes of industrialisation, the development of mobility systems within cities, and the development of electricity systems nationally and that have changed over time, that have contributed to the types of carbon spaces that have developed historically. And so an issue in trying to think about the construction of both carbon and low carbon spaces simultaneously is, well, how do we start to think, in what ways are low carbon futures being characterised in a general way? And we think we can start to characterise a number of different ways in which this is being done. Firstly, there's a predominant view which characterises low carbon futures as being technology based in many ways. This is techno-economic in its orientation, and it tries to, in some ways, link together technological pathways that are constructed through understanding of technological potential, technological cost, and the extent to which, through assumptions and modelling, that these technologies can contribute to decarbonisation pathways. And one can pick this up in examples such as the Committee on Climate Change Low Carbon Report in 2010. As a contrast to that sort of techno-economic approach, you can also see low carbon futures that are often framed as being about behavioural change and are much more socio-cultural in their orientation rather than techno-economic. In this respect, you can see this through examples such as the transition towns movement, where the more localised attempts to try and develop embedded notions of what low carbon futures aspire to be. There are frames that are being developed around low carbon finance. You can see reports by Accenture, by other large-scale consultants such as PricewaterhouseCoopers, Deloitte, these types of organisations who are trying to frame the low carbon financial opportunity. And what you start to get through these different windows onto low carbon futures is an understanding of different forms of low carbon knowledge. Techno-economic knowledge, socio-cultural forms of knowledge, financial forms of knowledge, often promoted by different forms of social interests. And what becomes interesting is the extent to which these different windows onto low carbon futures become configured or become aligned together, and the ways in which this is done and the ways in which this informs the governing of low carbon futures. And so where we get to with that those sorts of issues are questions about governing at the interface of infrastructure systems and territory, and trying to understand something about the types of configurations that constitute low carbon spaces, that constitute low carbon cities, regions and communities. Now, when one starts to think about what the makeup of those configurations look like, who the social interests are, who the institutional interests are, it's important to think about that not in the sense of this happening in terms of a blank sheet or starting from scratch. There is a historical context within which this happens. Not only is there a historical context urban and regionally, there's a wider international political context within which this is happening. And there are a set of crises that have developed, particularly over the last 4 or 5 years, thinking of the economic and financial crisis, but also ecological challenges, and the ways in which those crises constrain, but also open up opportunities for particular forms and low carbon configurations. And particularly important here, we think, is the role of the national state, and the role of the national state in the ways in which it can and does shape low carbon spaces in urban forms and in regional centres. One only needs to think back to the financial crisis and when the financial crisis sparked in 2007, and to think about the role the state played in turning on its head almost 30, 40 years of assumptions about the limitations of the role of the state that have been propounded certainly by the new right, but had also been picked up a lot across the political spectrum. And in responding to the financial and economic crisis, there was a sense that the state could intervene in different forms of way, should there be a political will to do so. And so interestingly, in terms of the role of the state, the dynamics that we're interested in trying to unpack and play about with are particularly to try and understand something about the nature of the relationship between the national state and subnational territories. What forms of dynamics are there between state and state space in constituting low carbon futures? Is this about the state and subnational territory working together to reinforce the status quo? Is it about getting the economic show back on the road? Is it about some notion of redistribution spatially between the state and subnational territory? Or is it about new forms of prioritisation between the state and different geographical areas? And an issue that cuts across this is the relationship between economy and ecology. We're interested to try and understand whether that dynamic between state and territory, state and space, whether that becomes at an economic level as being about more growth, about reassertion of the status quo that existed prior to 2007. Does it become about different forms of growth, new forms of green growth? Or is it about trying to move in some ways to different notions that go beyond conventional notions of growth? And thirdly, what does that mean, that relationship between state and space and economy and ecology, for the organisation of infrastructure systems? Does that mean that this is likely, that what is likely to follow is a national spatial plan for infrastructure that is underpinned by a serious political will? Or is it likely to result in forms of secessionism, infrastructural enclaves? Or is any form of plan a little too ambitious? Is this more about muddling through? And what about those alternatives that sit outside of the mainstream? What can they contribute to these sorts of debates? Okay, so what we're really trying to get at here is the nature of the relationship between low carbon strategies at an urban and regional scale that are being developed and capabilities to act in relationship to those strategies. And yet, what we're trying to research, what we're trying to understand, in many ways, is the future. It's not happened. It is happening, but it's not happened yet. We're trying to research low carbon futures, which may be 20, 30 years down the line in terms of where their aspirations may take them. So, with that in mind, the theories and concepts to try and research this are not pre-packaged and on the shelf. They need to be stitched together. And we've tried to stitch them together through thinking about a critical question, which is, how can we understand urban and regional low carbon transitions? And as you'll have picked up from what I've said so far, the relationship between cities, regions and infrastructure is less than straightforward. It's messy. It operates in terms of a multi-level governance, both in terms of what constitutes the city and what constitutes infrastructure systems and the relationships between them. And this often involves a wide range of interests, often disconnected. And so in trying to think about the sorts of spatial formations that are being constituted, that have started to be constituted in low carbon Britain, there are 4 sets of issues as a framework that we think is important to try and understand. First of all, given the importance of history that I mentioned a while ago, to understand something about the existing urban and regional context and how that attempts to condition, to configure, to structure the low carbon problem. To try and think about how these forms of governance are developing particular strategies in relation to specific cities and regions. And thirdly, to think what it means about in terms of the adaptability of governance and what forms of governance innovation may be required to translate those strategies into action. And fourthly, and we'll come back to this later, with what consequences. And so just trying to put a bit more flesh on this, when we start to think about the low carbon agenda and a national response, what's interesting about how this has manifested itself in the UK, certainly over the last 4 or 5 years, is the way in which there's been something of a shift from, in terms of the role of state intervention, from what we characterise, or what might be characterised as forms of industrial activism that emerged certainly post the financial crisis when Peter Mandelson came back at the end of the new Labour government. There were attempts to try and align the possibilities, the opportunities of low carbon futures with city and regional based legacies, histories, capabilities, skills and so on. And you could see that through the development of low carbon economic areas in different parts of the UK. The shift that's occurred post 2010 with the coalition government has been a shift from this element of industrial activism to austerity and governance fixes which attempt to, in some senses, embed austerity. There's been an attempt to regulate flows of investment to subnational territories, a stripping out of governance architecture in terms of the abolition of regional development agencies and other quangos at a national level, and their replacement with local economic partnerships, many more local economic partnerships and regional development agencies, with the consequence that there are significantly more spatial units competing for significantly less funding, and therefore an intensified competition between places for low carbon funding from the state. We think there's going to be something of a shift between these agendas over the coming years. There's going to be something of an oscillation, and you perhaps picked that up yesterday with Vince Cable's leaked letter, where he was trying to push some of this more industrial activist type agenda over the austerity agenda. And what we think is also going to be important is attempts to try and develop and embed these new governance frameworks, whether it's at the level of local economic partnerships, new city regional governance frameworks, and to try and understand not only the nature of the relationship between the national state and these new governing frameworks, but also the way in which the national state is starting to set out some parameters in terms of what it thinks the key elements of a low carbon agenda are at a national level. So national government's been pushing issues such as the development of offshore wind through the opening up of the seabeds off the coast of the UK to 9 offshore wind zones, attempts to develop new marketised constructions of offshore wind production. There's also been attempts, certainly through the Department for Transport, to develop an agenda around low carbon vehicles, and in particular to develop the forms of plug-in infrastructure that are often seen as running alongside low-carbon vehicles. And strategically, what's happened with this agenda is that this has not often been seen as being about a national strategy for plugged-in infrastructure, but it's about the prioritisation of particular urban centres. Thirdly, there are efforts to construct a market-based response to reconfiguring the built environment, to make the built environment more energy efficient through the government's coming Green Deal in the autumn. And fourthly, efforts through Ofgem to stimulate the necessary large-scale investment that's required to reconfigure the electricity grid, to reconnect sources of new production, if we're thinking here particularly about offshore wind, with centres of consumption, often in the southeast of England. So within that context of a national set of priorities, within the context of trying to understand something about the transition, what we think is interesting is to try and flesh out the sorts of responses that are being developed within different UK urban and regional contexts. And Simon will come up and say some more about that.
Thank you, Mike. So what we've been trying to do is use this framework to really try to understand something about the different nature of the dynamics of low carbon transition, looking through the lenses of 5 different parts of the UK. So over the last year, we've been squeezing in a programme of interviews, and it's been really quite remarkable trying to sort of excavate the dynamics of low carbon transition. Sometimes we've found ourselves in the Crown Estates office in central London, and the Crown Estates are a very active agent, particularly about the commodification and commercialisation of offshore wind assets. And other times we've been in the northeast of England, in former pit villages, where there's an incredible commitment to the notion of low carbon transition and the opportunities that it might present. We've also been to Scotland, Wales. We've done work in Greater Manchester, a set of interviews with policymakers, corporates and some community groups in London. So we've been trying to understand something about the sorts of visions that are being produced in these different contexts. What's the content? What's the notion of the transition? What are the social and material elements of the transition that's envisaged within these different urban and regional contexts? And to what extent might it be transformative, or is it really about a reflection of existing priorities and existing social relationships? So we've been trying to tease this out across these different contexts. We've interviewed something like 50 people during this process. I've been looking at policy documents, trying to disentangle the differences between the claims and the reality in these different contexts. So I just want to give you a little flavour of what low carbon Britain looks like through these 5 contexts. Oops. If I can use this. And the first context is in Greater London, where we did a lot of work in Greater London for the previous book that we did on world cities and climate change. And interestingly, when we were trying to get publishers interested in a book on low carbon transition in Britain, they all said, no, we want something like the last book that's much more internationally comparative. You know, you went to Melbourne and San Francisco and New York. We can sell a book about world cities and low carbon transition. We're not going to sell a book about low carbon transition in Britain. So we've had a real job trying to persuade publishers. They're not interested in writing in academic books that purely focus on the UK. So we've had a bit of a job in trying to get a paperback contract to do this work. But the argument is really about the way in which the UK government has a statutory commitment to carbon reduction targets, which mean the UK in some senses is an exemplar of low carbon transition that is distinctive and unique. And within that context, London occupies a particular role. London sees itself as being exemplary in relation to low carbon transition, as a leader in networks like the C40, and London is positioned by the national state in all sorts of ways to give it competitive advantages in terms of thinking about low carbon transition, in terms of its governance strategy, in terms of its prioritisation within the national state infrastructure, in the way that it's retained governance and economic development powers that have been abolished in the rest of England. The abolition of the RDAs, the London Development Agency was reincorporated in selective ways into existing governance structures. And there's three particular issues that London's interested in relation to low carbon transition. London has a high degree of expertise and understanding of the infrastructural requirements of its growth ambitions. London has a really in-depth understanding of the implications of its previous growth ambitions, spatially in employment and population terms, in terms of the implications for water, waste, energy and food. It's quite remarkable the degree to which London understands its infrastructure, and it's critically interested in ensuring the long-term continuity and security of those infrastructure endowments, and thinking about how it positions itself to ensure its continued economic reproduction. Part of that strategy is a very clear response around building relative autonomy. London wants to become less reliant on extended regional, national and international infrastructure networks, particularly on water, waste and energy, as it wants to build within London greater capacity to produce its own water, to clean its own water, to produce energy within London or proximate to London, and to reduce its reliance on waste disposal outside of London. So it's very much driven by thinking about how it can sort of develop a greater degree of security at the metropolitan level. And it does that with a very active group of cities, the C40, the Clinton Climate Initiative. It sees itself as piloting and developing responses that can be rolled out in other C40 cities, but also could be developed and extended to other UK cities. So it sees itself as a bit of a pilot for zero and low carbon demonstration in the Thames Gateway and other parts of London. And London has multiple intermediaries, organisational capacity within the Greater London Authority to develop these types of responses in terms of knowledge, capacity and capability when you compare it to other city regions in the UK. So if you think of Manchester, has 2.5 people working on local energy and renewable energy sources within the metropolitan area. London has a team of up to 60 people concerned with those issues, and funding and capacity and powers to act on reshaping the infrastructure network. So London sees itself in a very particular way in relation to this agenda as an exemplar and as a relationship between its aspirations and its capacity to act. Comparing that to somewhere like Greater Manchester, it's really quite interesting. Greater Manchester doesn't have the same governance frameworks. It's recently lost a lot of this sub-regional and city-regional and regional capacity to act around infrastructure, the discretionary funding it had through RDAs. So the city has to sort of make its capacity to act around low carbon. And actually, a pre-existing coalition of social interests, the social interests who were very active around the economic boosterists, who were very active around reconfiguring Manchester as a context for investment in housing, office, retail, have turned their attention to low carbon transition. Low carbon transition is seen by this coalition of interests as an economic opportunity, as a very particular sort of economic opportunity that the city region can develop. And a lot of work has gone into positioning Greater Manchester as a low carbon first mover. They were the first city region to do a city regional version of the Stern, the International National Stern Report, which tries to anticipate the economic costs of climate change and use that as a way of assembling a coalition of interests who were previously very orientated around property and land development, who have now become very active in terms of attracting external investment, thinking about business support, and see low carbon transition as an opportunity, as an economic opportunity primarily. And critical to that is positioning the city region as a test bed for the achievement of national targets. So Manchester's very much reinterpreted national carbon regulation and target setting and worked with the national state to position itself as a test bed, in particular for retrofitting. So this is this sort of particular sector that Manchester sees as being potentially an area that it can get some form of competitive advantage. By using the same sorts of techniques in terms of upscaling land assembly, thinking about supply chains, working with investors to come and do the low carbon transition in Manchester. And there's a high degree of experimentation around frameworks to attract inward investment, and a lot of work going on at the moment to try to position Manchester as an amenable context for large institutional and corporate investors who are interested in the economic opportunities offered by retrofitting and low carbon transition. Moving to the northeast of England, you find quite a different storyline. The northeast of England for a long time has been trying to develop a different economic rationale for itself in a context where it's had difficulties engaging in a productive debate with the national state about how such a framework might be reconstituted. But as Mike was talking about, the brief period of industrial activism created an opportunity for a much more intense set of relationships to develop between business and innovation departments in Whitehall, the Department of DEC, DCLG, around new ideas about the reconstitution and reconfiguration of the northeast economy. And there was a number of elements of that were developed quite actively through the support of the Regional Development Agency and sub-regional partnerships. First one was about extending the northeast, and the northeast particularly focused on offshore wind. It had ports, it had engineering capacity, it had space for the development of that industry, and it was quite close to a lot of the offshore wind resource. So wind became a very critical focus for the notion of low carbon and transition in the northeast of England. There was a second set of activities around trying to readapt the chemicals industry on Teesside, and a lot of work was done on the development of biofuels and the early development of biofuel capacity in industry as a way of trying to develop a different economic logic for that industry. And immediately after the economic crisis in 2007 and 8, particularly the implications for the Nissan and the car industry, a lot of work was done around electric vehicles. And a coalition of interests in the northeast started a set of activities around electric vehicle recharging initiatives alongside government commitments to provide additional funding to Nissan. The production of the Nissan Leaf within the northeast, although Nissan Leafs will not be used in the northeast of England, they'll all be exported. So there's some interesting ways in which initiatives to develop the early pilots in electric vehicle charging are actually quite disconnected from the actual production specialisms in the northeast context. So this was very much around a notion of trying to defend the northeast of England, to think about the reconfiguration of its industry around the opportunities that seem to be present by represented by a notion of low carbon transition in this period of industrial activism. But the whole infrastructure that was assembled, the institutional infrastructure of the regional development agencies, the centres of expertise and specialism in renewables and biofuels, have all been abolished. The RDAs have gone, the sub-regional partnerships have gone, the centres of excellence have gone. And it's very interesting when you're doing interviews, you're seeing the end of people. We're interviewing people who are no longer going to be working in these institutions. Some of them might be staying, there might be some continuity, but there's been very little effort to try to retain this expertise that's been developed around these areas in that context. Scotland is a very interesting story where there's this very strong interconnection between Scotland's economic aspirations that are very closely tied to low carbon energy sources and low carbon transition. And Scotland, of course, has devolved powers around the economy and around energy as well. So Scotland started to link together in a very tight way its economic and its energy strategy, which is very much orientated around offshore wind resources, off tidal resources, which Scotland is described sometimes as the Saudi Arabia of renewables, given the level of resource that's present. And more recently, there's been an interconnection between the debate about further powers or potential independence and the way in which low carbon transition might provide an economic context to support some of Scotland's political aspirations around the greater devolution or forms of independence. So here there's been a very, very strong tying together of low carbon transition, notions of Scottish futures and Scottish independence. And Scotland's worked really hard to try and utilise the powers that it has in the Assembly to constitute some enlarged notion of what a low carbon transition might look like and how it might be tied to the constitution of a Scottish future. So they've tried to occupy a position of leadership within the UK around wind resources in particular, and made significant investments there, and externally in terms of thinking about their relationship with the rest of Europe. There's energy initiatives that are strongly orientated around the revitalisation of the Highlands and Islands and a set of smaller scale initiatives, and the prioritisation of urban energy resources in the central belt of Scotland, around Glasgow and Edinburgh. And there's an attempt to try to reconstitute some notion of low carbon transition that's tied to a consideration of alternative and invigorated governance frameworks. Finally, Wales. Wales is constituted in a slightly different way. It doesn't have the same powers and controls over shaping the energy economy that Scotland has, but it has much more than the English regions do. And here, the notion of low carbon transition has been used as a way of trying to think about the knitting together of a diverse, Wales is quite a diverse context. And energy was seen as a really quite key issue in trying to knit together some notion of how low carbon transition might link together city regions and intra-regional notions of Wales and Welsh identity. But also Wales has carefully thought about its relationship between Welsh energy assets and potential low carbon transition, particularly around hydrogen, and the interrelation with the UK, particularly notions around a hydrogen corridor along South Wales and the M4. So it's trying to think about the constitution of low carbon transition within Wales and in parts of Wales, but also about the interconnections between Wales and the rest of the UK. And within that, there's use of low carbon transition in particular communities, particular island communities in Holyhead, and particular communities in former post-industrial South Wales as well. So there's an attempt to try to start to align geographical strengths and low carbon priorities to meet other national UK targets around selectivity in terms of alternative fuels and bigger notions of hydrogen corridors. So what you start to see when you look across these different contexts is actually quite different notions of a vision about what low carbon transition might look like and how it might be constituted. Visions of the exemplary nature, of the leading nature of some contexts, a form of economic boosterism and potential growth, potentially a form of transformative industrial interventionism, relations with notions of low carbon independence, and ideas about the remaking and reconstitution of Wales and Welsh identity. And underneath that, you find different types of strategies and different types of strategic prioritisations in terms of how those aspirations translate into capacity and capability and aspirations and action in terms of who's targeted, what are the sorts of social interests that are involved in the constitution of these strategies. To what extent do they reflect local priorities, or are they about the transmission and assertion of national targets and priorities into local contexts? The degree to which they're about selectivity in terms of the spatial configurations and formations that are being constituted, or the extent to which they might constitute some bigger notion, some new notions of national or regional identities. And when you start to look at the social and the material changes that sit underneath of those visions in terms of those priorities, you start to see very different types of emphasis in terms of what the focus of activity is. Strong focus around issues to do with flooding, flood protection, very strong focus around particular sorts of technologies, particularly on the urban cores, particularly thinking about the relationship between existing infrastructure, ports, refineries, plug-in points, electrical interconnections and different types of fuels. So you can start to see this is a very low carbon transition starts to translate into a quite different geography that often strongly reflects the existing logic in which the low carbon transition is inserted and is produced and co-produced. 6 points in conclusion then. What struck us about trying to uncover the dynamics of low carbon transition in different contexts is the dominance of a techno-economic logic. We've worked very hard to try to understand the way in which this techno-economic logic might have broader societal visions or broader technological expectations. We've looked hard to try and find alternative, more sort of bottom-up, local community responses, of which there is many, but they're strongly disconnected. The bottom-up community responses of transition towns and community groups are incredibly strongly disconnected from these top-down techno-economic strategies, and it's hard to find an interrelationship between the two. The second point is, this is a very particular take on the interrelationship between the economy and environment. This is not about local Agenda 21. This is not about sustainable cities. This is about a form of carbon regulation that links to a set of economic opportunities. So it's a very particular take on ecology. It's a much narrower take on ecology, and it's much less interested in thinking about a broader notion of environment and ecology and questions about control of ecology, questions about social justice and environmental justice. This is a much narrower notion of that relationship. The interrelationship between the national and urban and regional is incredibly varied in this, when you start to look at the geography of this process. And places are positioned in very different ways. I mean, Greater Manchester, the context that we know best, positions itself as a test bed. This is for others to come and do the low carbon transition to Manchester. Where in other contexts, there's at least an attempt to try to reassert particular sorts of social, political priorities that try to shape and create some form of broader or wider opportunity for low carbon transition that reflects local context rather than national priorities. And as, of course, the capacity and capability to act varies enormously across these contexts. And it really strikes us how working in the English periphery, which has lost a lot of the infrastructure, the governance infrastructure that enabled it to constitute some sort of more systemic activity, and you compare that with the Welsh and the Scottish and the London situation, you see very, very significant differences in the ability of cities and regions to shape something that we might describe or understand as systemic in trying to bring together the social and technical and the projects and the notion of system change. And I think it really concerns us about the nature of austerity governance in terms of what do these changes really mean about the differential capacity of places to respond to low carbon transition. And the way in which increasingly, in the later set of work we were doing, particularly in northeast of England and in the northwest, much more interested in what could community groups do as the capacity to act through the formal policy process, an expectation that this notion of transition, is it communities who can provide an answer of some sort of prefigurative change in the system? What will corporates come and do? How can we make ourselves amenable to corporates? And you see the squeezing out of a broader public and societal debate about the role of the state and local government within that context. So where are the alternative futures? I think our concern is we need to try to bring together the externally produced priorities. Context just can't become a site for the implementation of some national notion of low carbon transition. We need to find a better way of bringing context-specific priorities and externally produced priorities together in a more configurational and active way to try to open up the notion of how low carbon transition might be reconstituted. And as part of that, we also need to start to try to bring together notions of one-off project niches, experimental responses with some broader notion about what systemic change might mean in the configuration of energy, infrastructure systems and other aspects of urban and regional life. How do we learn about the flexibility of energy systems? How can we overcome obduracy? And to what extent can we learn in a more systematic manner from the huge diversity of activities that are taking place in these contexts? Thanks very much.
Well, thank you both Mike and Simon. We have plenty of time for questions and comments, feedback to the speakers. Who would like to begin? Don't be shy. Gentleman in the middle there. Maybe just say who you are, if you wouldn't mind, when you speak.
My name is Dinesh. In these goals of like a low carbon transition, to what extent is there social action towards carbon decrease through a decrease in meat consumption or food production, or the ways that UK contributes to carbon globally and not just here? So yes, we may reduce our carbon through our buildings and through the way cities are designed, but what to what extent are we consuming more goods or taking in more products that elsewhere in the world carbon is increasing because of what's happening in the UK?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the cities who are engaged in activity, the cities who are very active in terms of thinking about their carbon budgets are asking themselves some quite interesting questions about these boundary issues. So what we've found is when large city regions are undertaking work around their carbon budget and trying to understand that into the future, they're starting to ask questions about whether or not they can make an argument, and this is in the context of targets, national targets, potentially being place-based. So at the moment there isn't a sort of local authority target as such. There is for local authority buildings, but not for the city as a whole. But that might happen. And they're starting to ask questions about, can we make an argument, for example, that an airport shouldn't be included in if an airport's located within the city region, should that airport be included or not included in that city's carbon budget? So what cities have started to get interested in is to what extent, if in a period of carbon regulation and carbon constraint, they're starting to ask questions about how might it be possible to create headroom to allow future development to take place by transferring carbon emissions outside of city boundaries or to other scales of responsibility. So what I'm saying is, I think there was a really serious issue about the extent to which urban strategies might engage in activities to displace carbon into other contexts or into other jurisdictions.
I think there's another set of issues here in the sense that often, certainly in the north of England, the northeast of England and Wales, there's a set of issues that this is, in many ways, isn't about carbon. It's about economic development. And because the governance capability to act in terms of economic development has been effectively stripped out, the low carbon agenda becomes almost the next strategy for economic accumulation for some of these contexts. So in many ways it's not really about carbon. The low carbon just becomes a mobilisation for economic development, certainly in the north of England. And often with the stripping out of these governing architectures, any attempt to get consistent frameworks for measuring carbon within a context get stripped out and get lost as well. So this issue about the relationship between the project and the systemic, you can see that often because of piecemeal funding streams, because of the stripping out of governance architecture, that responses are often disconnected and project-based rather than something that's more systemic, joined up, strategic, long-term.
Okay, thank you. Okay, this was sparked off a whole range of issues. Gentlemen at the second from the back there.
I've got a question that kind of follows on from that first question, which focused on the carbon kind of balance between cities and elsewhere, where the carbon balance might be something that it would be inconceivable to imagine a situation where the cities would be self-contained and self-fulfilling in terms of carbon and energy and everything else. But that's maybe something you might want to comment on as well. But the question really was about, if we take the position where cities essentially have to get things in which have some kind of environmental impact from outside the city to sustain themselves, that's food, water, energy, etc., etc. You know, if you like, the moral argument for the existence of cities is that actually we get something from them. That actually, as a population, nationally, regionally, internationally, cities actually produce something for that and actually something of value. Which kind of gets us into an interesting connection between the if you like, the ecological cost, or an environmental cost of cities and the populations, and the benefit that we get from it. Would you want to just maybe comment on that, as to make those connections? Because I don't think anyone would actually say that that should be a nil-sum balance, that we shouldn't ever have cities if their carbon footprint, it means that they're costing the world carbon, because there's the other side of the equation, that there's the things that cities produce.
I mean, I don't think we're suggesting that cities we're not questioning the existence of cities. What we're saying, what we're interested in is, I mean, cities represent themselves in different ways in relation to climate change. So cities can simultaneously represent themselves as being victims of climate change, where the effects are particularly keenly felt. They're often and sometimes represented as being the critical sites for the production of carbon emissions. So some estimates are that 80% of energy consumption and perhaps as much as 75% of carbon emissions are associated with cities, but of course it depends on how you count them. So there's an argument that cities are the problem, which I don't entirely agree with either. And there's another argument that we've been particularly interested in. A group of cities argue that they're particularly innovative sites of response. And the same cities can actually display all of those arguments simultaneously, depending on the nature of the constituencies they're trying to engage with. Now, I think the issue would be, well, what are cities trying to do? Are they trying to? What are the motivations for engaging in this activity? In terms of, let's look at the point you started with. Could they become more self-reliant and autonomous? Right? Could you? You might be familiar. Do you remember Buckminster Fuller's Dome over New York? A really nice. Buckminster Fuller in 1967 had this idea, and it was about climate. It was about trying to. Over central Manhattan, he designed this geodesic dome, and it was partly about trying to protect New York from heat waves, from rain, and it was this notion of trying to create some sort of enclosed environment. Now, are cities really trying to secure and bound themselves in a world where there might be increased vulnerability, particularly in infrastructural flows of energy, water, waste, and food? Are they trying to do that to build a degree of place-based and bounded security? Or is it really, or is the other issue, are they trying to contribute to collective planetary security? And I think that's an interesting question, because I think if they were about contributing to collective planetary security, I think you would problematize consumption. In the strategies, you would see much more of a focus in the urban agenda on reducing demand. And actually, when you look at cities, and cities outside of the ones we've talked about today, cities we've looked at in a couple of other large pieces of work, there's a big emphasis on production, not on problematizing or thinking through questions about demand and reducing reducing the way in which cities reach out and suck resources in. So I think that's where you might start to be able to answer that question by saying, well, what is it that these cities are trying to do in terms of the degree of securitization? And a set of questions about the relationship between productionist and consumption demand-orientated responses. And it's the consumption demand-orientated responses which are not the priority.
I think there's often a disconnection, certainly in the UK, between infrastructure systems and the governance of cities. So if you look, for example, how the electricity system is organised regionally within a national framework, and then you get a sort of city governance. You think about London, where it's got its mayoral system. When you try to sort of think about how the governance arrangements in London can start to get control over something like the electricity system, trying to build up that sort of capacity is not something that's going to happen in any short space of time. So you saw Ken Livingstone actually had quite ambitious aspirations around relative self-sufficiency. Talked about 25% electricity from decentralised energy by 2025, re-internalising most of London's waste landfill back inside London. So there are efforts to do that, but then you sort of get into political cycles. Livingstone's gone, Boris is in, and there's this sort of disconnection between political cycle, urban governance arrangements, and the governance of socio-technical networks, and it's trying to create some sort of embedded intermediary context in terms of governance that can hold those together over a long period of time rather than just intervene in this sort of project-based way.
Katie.
Thank you, first of all, for your talk. I thought it was very interesting to have these 5 different cases and the sort of descriptive narratives of these different areas. I think something that was curiously absent for me from the description was something you just touched on now, which is the role of utilities. I mean, I was actually kind of surprised, given what you talked about, that you ended up with this diagram at the end talking about a configurational intermediary, but hadn't talked about utilities which act in, upon, and across, I think, all of the different cases that you looked at. So, and may also have something to do with that focus on production, because utilities are incredibly powerful existing actor within the systems and networks that you're looking at. And so the relationship between the multi-level governance structures that you looked at and then the sort of economic framework that utilities really do provide, I mean, they are a force to be reckoned with. So I wondered if you could comment on that.
I mean, I think you're right. They should be a key actor in any notion of systemic or purposive socio-technical change around low carbon transition. Interestingly, they're seen as a very conservative force within many of the contexts that we've been interviewing in. And actually, they're seen as being locked in to particular priorities, particular notions of system change that tend to be fairly, how might you characterize them? They're very economically driven by the regulatory system. They are very much focused around cost reduction, and they're not seen as a particularly innovative partner in many of the initiatives that these cities are trying to develop, to be quite honest. And they're seen as being the cities are trying to work with other partners and new entrants who they think might be able to culturally and in terms of their businesses develop a different type of response. So they're not necessarily seen as a particularly important agent of change in many of these contexts. And in fact, they're often represented to us as being part of the problem.
Do you think that the utilities would agree with that characterization of themselves?
The utilities say things like, you tell us what you want and we can do it. What they really mean when you push them a bit further is, you tell us what you want and pay for it and we can do what you want. So they don't see themselves. I mean, they're part of the regime that many of these initiatives is trying to reshape. So they're not seen as an active agent and partner in many of the contexts. Is that fair? That's.
I mean, the electricity utility of the northwest of England is organised across the northwest of England with all its spatial variations, from rural Cumbria down to the city regions of Merseyside and Greater Manchester. And the two city regions account for around 3/4 of total electricity consumption in the northwest of England. Yet, what Simon's saying about the lack of systematic engagement between city regional authorities and the utilities is right.
Mm. Just to give you one example of that, I mean, we did a lot of work in American cities, which have and the cities themselves. What was very interesting is those cities also had problems with the utilities in terms of San Francisco has very ambitious energy strategy. Has a very interesting energy strategy, and they constantly have problems with the utilities not connecting up new resources, not investing in the initiatives, being very slow. Things that people would describe to us in the UK. But what they could do in San Francisco is the cities were part of the regulatory regime. And there were some really interesting things about the American system where the cities reshape the regulatory regime. And San Francisco had this very ambitious photovoltaic strategy. The Con Ed was being very difficult about this strategy. And they could reshape the regulatory system to make Con Ed be a more amenable participant in the notion of an urban energy transition produced by San Francisco City, in a way that UK cities do not have that ability to reshape the regulatory system at all. It's a constant source of frustration for all of them.
There's a lot more variety in the way in which US utilities operate and see their roles as well.
Yeah.
You just go a little bit further south to Southern California, right, and you have a very different perspective on innovation from Connie. Michael.
Thank you very much for the talk. I want to ask you something about the conceptualization of what you're talking about. First, I want to ask you something about gossip. Given that we're in an academic context, I should probably do the former, but both of them actually come around a notion of how we think about the commons. And your starting point, I guess, is this not something teleological, but is an assumption of the inevitability of the move to low carbon, which I think we probably all agree with, but we might want to pick apart with it. And so, I suppose the conceptual part of what I want to ask about is how you're thinking about the commons and the tragedy of the commons. And when I was saying in the beginning about the different kinds of knowledge that make some of these problems visible in particular ways, I was thinking that if you take Stern, that Stern appears at a particular moment in British history where the Treasury becomes sanctioned as a site of certain kinds of knowledge production, and economics becomes a discipline through which certain kinds of problematic are made visible, which means that in the context of the ecological moment, then a certain notion of externalities is made visible through the knowledge of economics, which is part of what was, I think, was kind of implicit in what you're saying. So I suppose what I would like to hear a little bit more about in terms of some of the things you're saying about what the limits are to certain kinds of knowledges that make visible the commons, the tragedy of the commons, and the notion of externalities through either economics or what you described as socio-cultural or other ways of thinking about these things might work differently. And I suppose that the corollary part of the gossip of this is, I mean, I'm knowing something about at least a couple of the examples that you talked through. That I was just wondering on the gossip side about how much you're taking, without being too caricatured, how much you're taking seriously what people are telling you.
Yeah.
Because it's fine for all these places to have grand rhetorics, exactly what they mean. In terms of the examples that I know about, I think there's quite a distance between the rhetoric and the policy implementation. I mean, if you go to somewhere like Hamburg and you see in the new documents in Hamburg whatever is right or wrong about that new model, all the buildings are built with a planning code that assumes a certain sea level rise, that assumes the inevitability of flooding, that assumes a certain kind of resilience as part of land use and development coding of that new urban fabric. And then you place it alongside some of the rhetorics that you're talking about in the UK. I'm not tempted to go back to your publisher and say, you should do the comparative thing, but I suppose it's what extent one is taking these geographies, these rhetorical geographies of the policy world seriously, not least in the ways in which they're thinking of, as you say, commons as opposed to just a sense of what low carbon is in terms of rhetorical frameworks.
Taking your last point first, in some of these contexts we've done work over an 8-year period, and if we were talking to you 8 years ago about the northeast of England, we'd have been talking about the hydrogen economy. If we were in Manchester, we'd be talking about something else. It wouldn't have been climate change. In fact, it would have been ecology as impediment. You know, people campaigning against the expansion of the airport. It would have been very different. So we would accept that these are aspirations, they're social visions, they're technological aspirations and expectations that are being established in these contexts. And they assume and paint a picture of transformation, of quite radical system change. Their ability to realise those changes, we don't accept, we don't see necessarily as inevitable, but it sometimes has material consequences in terms of prioritisation of particular forms of investment, relationships, the development of particular sorts of schemes and initiatives and responses. So in a sense, we're trying to, they also, I think, reflect particular sets of social interests. So the other issue that we're interested in is the degree to which are these notions of system change, are they locked in? Are particular social interests going to be defining the nature of what transition means in these contexts? Or could it be different? And we are interested in this question of could it be different? Could you enlarge the notion of social interests that might be engaged and enrolled within them? Are there competing notions of what might constitute low carbon transition? And is it, and this might be a slightly naive aspiration, but is it possible to start to think of ways of bringing together the more techno-economic, the more exclusive coalitions that we've found constituting these visions and expectations? Is it possible to open those up to other voices and social interests, to get different types of questions onto the agenda about the nature of this response? So I don't think we necessarily see it as inevitable, but we see the way in which particular sets and contexts seem to shape quite powerfully what is and what isn't possible in relation to low carbon transition.
I think it's just picking up that point about the teleological. You know, it's not that we're characterising an end point as such. We're taking some reference points, and the reference points is whether you go at a national level, you go to Greater Manchester, the North East, you'll pick up a strategy that has a vision to 2050, to 2030, to 2020. Or whatever that happens to be. And what we're interested in is trying to understand something, and it's a point you picked up about often the very large gap between these grand aspirations and what they translate into. And what they often translate into is exclusive capabilities, because they've been produced by exclusive capabilities. So you know, when Simon was talking about Greater Manchester and the low carbon agenda just being almost its latest accumulation strategy. If you go back to the demise of the Greater Manchester Council, which was the formal metropolitan authority in the mid-80s, what emerged into that space was an entrepreneurial urban growth coalition, more informal, made up of business elites, made up of political elites, which in many ways was given the hiding that it almost just had taken from Whitehall. It was trying to find new ways of engaging with Whitehall. So it was a narrow elite-based coalitions, externally focused, trying to engage with Whitehall, and the cost in many ways of doing that was a neglect of city regional publics. So the building of effective sub-city regional relationships with community groups, with different neighbourhood groups, has never really effectively taken place.
Okay. I've got
two questions from the same geographical area. If you'd studied the third devolved region in the UK, you would have found a coalition and a Green New Deal created by the Confederation of British Industries, the Irish Confederation of Trade Unions, Friends of the Earth, several hundred community and voluntary groups that actually, and the second bit of the question, emphasise not production but conservation, mass insulation and so on as a way going through. And that's what surprised me about the cases you came through. Of course, the government only done a tenth of it. Somebody Wilson couldn't come through to that. And you'd also see, and so I'm interested if you're comparing in other places, you'd find, I'm thinking also what Eamon Ryan did in the Republic of Ireland before that government fell over, that why these seem to do so much on production and not actually start thinking about conservation, insulating buildings, all these other things that you do pretty early on in the transition, if you thought about it.
Okay. I mean, in the Welsh context, there's been a very interesting response around something called our bed, which has some of the characteristics that you're describing from one of the Irish contexts that you're talking about, where the Welsh Assembly government, because of its commitment to sustainable development as an overarching policy discourse and priority, constituted a notion of retrofit that was not driven by carbon targets. It was driven primarily around fuel poverty and social equity. It was driven by then employment, then regeneration, then issues to do with carbon reduction came, I think, 5th or 6th in their list of priorities. And that produced a very, very different response, comparative response, when you look at the way in which retrofit has been particularly been configured by the coalition government around Green Deal, because the Welsh Assembly's aspirations for our bed have actually come under significant challenge by the logic of Green Deal, which has a very different logic to it. And the Welsh Assembly government are now trying to work out how do they, is it possible for them to maintain their place-based and political priorities around retrofit, which was driven by a very particular set of local priorities and conditions, and had a very particular geography associated with it. It wasn't focused on the cores, it was focused in the valleys, it was focused in former mining communities. It's a very different notion of retrofit, and that logic has now been challenged by the Green Deal logic, which has a view of retrofit that is about the constitution of retrofit as an economic opportunity, about new large-scale market entrance into retrofit, and about energy savings, the energy savings from retrofit funding the installation of measures. So actually, what we've seen in some of these contexts is the squeezing out of that capacity and the prioritisation of other sorts of issues. So it's not that they don't exist, but the story we'll tell in terms of the Welsh context is about the difficulty they've had in maintaining a focus on demand, but doing that in a way that they see as being socially just and equitable.
Gentleman over here. Unrelated to a point earlier on, Tim Marshall from Oxford British University outside of here. I feel that the view of 5 cases that you gave us was fascinating, and the way these variations come out. But I do think you have to emphasise the rhetorics do take place within a very particular state context, which if you looked at how, say, different regions in France or Germany or the Netherlands were responding to their national context, where you're not in a non-policy zone. I would say this was, you call it no carbon nation, but really there's no policy. There hasn't been. You might say there was one in sort of very embryonic form, 2008, 2009. But basically, this is a non-policy zone. This is not directly pushed strongly by the national state. Whereas in Germany and France and the Netherlands, they've both evolved economic narratives over a period of years, some slightly more longer, obviously, in Germany, and federal and at state level in Germany. Whereas a city, as you say, like Hamburg, has got a sort of a whole story there with which then the regional narrative or the city narrative can then, as it were, develop its own particularity, but within a particular set of pressures, drivers, and also national economic corporations working in a completely different way. So, to some extent, because your concentration was on UK, and I know very well, you do an enormous amount of work internationally, that didn't come over in so clearly, and so this sort of, not exactly swallowing of the rhetorics, but sort of presenting them to us as if they were 100% real, but you know, in fact, that they're not going to be acted on. I mean, even the word low carbon nation has a sort of fuzzy feel to it to me, because we are a high carbon nation, and I don't see anything in the political campaigns of the big parties to move us away from being a high carbon nation. So is Scotland possibly accepted? I think Scotland is such a sort of outlier in your cases that it almost doesn't sit next to them properly for me. Anyway, I mean, there's not going to be critical, it's just a sort of commentary.
Just trying to think about the point you raised about the national policy context. And I think, just trying to think about some of the work that we've done in a national context. I don't think that what we're trying to say is that there's an integrated set of policies, or there's a particularly strong political will. What we've tried to do through the work that we've done over the last 3 or 4 years, and through the interview program that we've done in Whitehall, is to try and understand something about the landscape of different policy priorities which de facto constitute something that may be called the low carbon policy landscape nationally, and to understand something about the sorts of agenda they're pushing. So through 2008-2009 was the development of a low carbon transition plan, low carbon industrial strategy, and you can see that picked up many of the sort of aspects of industrial activism that we talked about in the talk, but quite quickly got put to bed when the austerity agenda kicked in, and when the more sort of marketized Green Deal types of responses were picked up. So we're not trying to say that we're not trying to load in behind a sort of a position that says that there's a well-defined, purposive political will for low carbon transition. We're trying to sketch out what we think the parameters are of policy that may constitute a low carbon policy regime in inverted commas.
Okay, let me just see who else would like to come in with a question. Make sure we can get you all in from time. Any other takers? Kelly, is there anybody else? Any others? Okay, I'm going to take them both together, if I may, and then ask Mike and then Simon to respond and make any final remarks. Mark and then Nicky.
Yeah, I'm glad we finally got onto the national policy context, because that seems to me the most important one in lots of ways. I a few years ago ran a UK-wide programme looking at refurbishment of district heating networks, and the responses of different parts of the UK was really staggering, and chimes to an extent with your description. But it was a national programme, and we were talking about the utilities just now. And in a sense, the utilities we have now are a figment of the 1989 Electricity Act, and before that the 1949 Electricity Act. And in a certain sense, DEC is now almost becoming a figment of the utilities because of the extent to which they are influencing policy that goes on there. So we are ending up in this quite enclosed little loop there, which we need to break out of quite severely. But one of the big questions is, do we have a market that's dominated by 6 utilities going forward, or like Germany, do we go down the route of having 2 million generators in the market where they can begin to start ignoring the big utilities in policy terms and geopolitical terms, if you like. But I come back to the point that the landscape is a national one, and we haven't even mentioned the word Ofgem yet. It's a regulatory regime, it's a regulated market. And whether you talk about district heating or building schools for the future and building low carbon schools, you're talking about a national framework within which, whether it's local governments or Carillion and Wilmot Dixon, you end up with a package which is determined centrally it's a very centralised market still.
Okay.
Yeah, this might be partly sort of contradiction with that, but sort of pulling up on that. You've got quite a lot of the narrative on sort of techno-economic dominance, and definitely agree you have to pick up on sort of the national discussion on this and sort of the national policy level. But I was wondering whether there wasn't more to say, not just about how that links the various cases you've got, but also what links various cases you've got without going through the national level. So what's city to city rather than borough to borough, rather than sort of even sub-city levels connected to the other cases you've got. Because you hinted at that in talking about London, and I totally agree that London speaks to other cities. But there might be more to that, including Scotland and Wales.
Okay, thanks. Mike, would you like to respond and give us any final comments?
I'm just trying to organise my thoughts, Steve.
As part of this work, we've also done a set of interviews around the four dominant state logics: offshore wind, Green Deal, the new interconnect, the whole debate about the electricity grid and reconfiguration of the electricity grid, and we've been looking at low emission vehicles as well. So there's a whole other set of work we've been doing to try and understand the constitution of the dominant trajectories of socio-technical change envisaged by the national state. And we haven't really talked about those today, but they're a critical part of the argument. And what's interesting is when you get inside those debates with Ofgem and with other sets of social interests, is the degree to which collective responses, cities, local government, often doesn't really exist. This is about the constitution of market opportunities. We had I can remember years ago, I've spent some time in Whitehall as an academic on placements, and I've always been quite interested, and I've done that over a quite a long period of time. And we were doing an interview with somebody who was in the offshore, who had come from the private sector to work within a state institution around the promotion of offshore wind. And at the end of the interview, we asked this person, what was it like? What are the main differences between working for a corporate in wind and working in this institute, this part of the state apparatus? And this person said, there isn't any difference. There is no difference. And I can remember thinking, well, what do you mean? He said, well, the industry trusts us. We don't tell ministers everything. They trust us not to tell ministers everything. So this notion of the public, and actually we found this happened a few times, didn't it? I mean, the constitution of these frameworks is very much around a particular, the marketisation of these as opportunities. And a number of these interviews talking about responses, talking about urban responses or regional responses or the constitution of collective responses, or how you link together these very disconnected policy responses. It's not on the agenda whatsoever, not on the agenda at all. And even in questions about economic development and employment, were not on the agenda at all. It is very different. You're right. It's very different to Germany. Very, very different in terms of how this response is being constituted. And we didn't mean to be a mouthpiece for these responses. That wasn't our intention. And I think, I need to think a little bit more about how to present this material. But that wasn't what we were trying to do with this. So that's a point well taken.
I think if you take a title like Low Carbon Nation, it's not modest in its ambition, and we're trying to cover a lot of ground here. So we take the points that there are going to be gaps in the analysis. What we wanted to do though between us after our last book, which was looking at world cities and climate change, and looked at some of these network relationships between cities, was to try and think really in light of the economic and financial crisis, what was going on within our own state space. I mean, for me that was a political issue, personal political issue, to try and understand something about what's happening to the state of the nation that I live in, what's happening to the city that I live in and what is happening to it relative to other sets of contexts within the UK. Now, you know, given where we started in terms of trying to do something called Low Carbon Nation, it's a thesis, and there are going to be sets of issues and questions that are flagged up at the end, which I'm sure that we'll develop further in our next project.
Thank you. Do you have a final?
No, thanks
Final word?
very much for the interesting questions.
Very helpful.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Please
you.
join me in thanking our speakers.